Hey, I'm Tim, founder of Kintro, an agency that helps fast-growing B2B companies make use of the latest AI to automate sales tasks and generate pipeline. With me today is Professor Frank Cespedes from Harvard Business School. Frank is a senior lecturer at HBS, former operator and board member, and the author of 6 books on strategy and sales, including Aligning Strategy and Sales and Sales Management That Works. His work has appeared in Harvard Business Review, Wall Street Journal, MIT Sloan Management Review, and others. Frank, welcome.
Tim, thank you very, very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Excellent. Let's dive straight in. So in your HBR article called Defining a Post-Pandemic Channel Strategy, you argue that the effects of technology changes or major events like a pandemic are often overstated. Rather, you say they accelerate trends that are already underway. Now, many VC-backed firms in San Francisco would tell you that with AI, this time it's different. Do you disagree?
Yeah. Well, I hate to begin our conversation by sounding like the proverbial professor. On the one hand, this, on the other hand, that. But this time it's different is what people on Wall Street always say when stocks are rising. It's not a bubble. This time it's different. And most of the time it turns out to be a bubble because of, what we call regression to the mean. I think what's closer to the truth is the phrase that's associated with Mark Twain. History never repeats itself, but it does rhyme. And I think that's where we are right now with AI, artificial intelligence, and sales. The article that you just referenced basically looked at how new technologies have been viewed repeatedly for over a century. And the theme was always, this time it's different. It's going to obliterate everything we know in terms of sales, when the reality was very, very different as it evolved, as it became integrated in actual workflows. The telephone in the 1930s. I can show you articles in Fortune magazine and others at the time that said, once we have telephones throughout the United States, we probably don't need salespeople because you and I can call each other up directly and negotiate price. That didn't happen. The National Highway System in the 1950s, again, a series of articles that said, once we've got all these roads, people can just get in their cars and shop for the best price or the best product. Didn't happen. Similarly, about 25, 30 years ago, when the internet, at the time, if you remember, it was called the information superhighway, similar sorts of predictions. The reality, I think, is that each time the technology has made a difference. I'm not the first to say the most important technology in sales was the telephone, right? It did make a difference, but it accelerated productivity. It changed buying, and as a result, it changed sales tasks, but it didn't make the kinds of differences that many, many people currently are speculating about AI. I think Twain is right, or was right. History never repeats itself, but it rhymes.
And so what does change in B2B sales then? Characterize a little bit, and we'll go into the case study with SAP in a bit, but characterize maybe in general what AI does in sales.
Well, especially in B2B sales, I think in the short term, and by the short term, I mean now and the next few years, it accelerates many, many important research, administrative, and what I would call cadence tasks in B2B sales. Customer research, right? In B2B sales, you need to know about your customer, their business. You've got to integrate. Most B2B products are components in a larger usage system. At the end of the day, the customer needs to manage that usage system. Your product or service has to fit into that. That requires customer research. Now, AI is not perfect. We all know it hallucinates, but AI accelerates tremendously what good B2B salespeople do in finding out about their customer business. So that's one important issue. Administrative reports. You know, when I quote this data I'm about to quote, Tim, many people are surprised, but it's data that has been now supported by multiple research studies. If you ask yourself a basic question about salespeople, how much time do they actually spend in customer contact? And by customer contact, I mean all forms. I don't just mean, making a sales pitch virtually or in person. I mean demos, webinars, emails, etc. The numbers vary obviously by business, but on average, it's about 30 to 35%, meaning that a lot of time is not spent in customer contact. And one reason, not the only reason, but one reason is the amount of time that salespeople spend on administrative tasks. AI is perfect for automating that, again, saving time there. CRM inputs, for example, AI will make a big and positive difference. If you look at most AI systems in sales, the data they depend on is from the company's CRM system. That is notoriously noisy and unreliable data, not because of the software, nothing wrong with the software, but as usual in business because of the human inputs, right? They're very subjective. I say that a lead is anybody I bumped into in the street. You say a lead is somebody that actually has a budget. All the CRM system does is aggregate that. AIA is probably better than people at automating that. Email cadences and other cadences of that sort. The point I want to make is that in the short and intermediate term, AI saves time in sales. And that is a very, very big deal because time is usually money in sales. When you save time, you're not only making a significant productivity impact, but what you're also doing in sales in particular is increasing the total addressable market. In other words, segments that were economically infeasible now become feasible with better go-to-market utilization. So I think that's the short and intermediate term. And companies that aren't taking advantage of that are just foolish, right? Longer term, however, I think what AI does, it requires sales managers to rethink their sales models in order to get the benefits from the technology. So I think there's low-hanging fruit. And one thing I learned running a business is eat the low-hanging fruit. Never look down your nose at low-hanging fruit. But if you're really going to optimize the technology, at the end of the day, it's going to be about the sales model. It's not going to be about the tech.
Yeah. And we'll talk about that a little more in a second. But let's talk about who actually adopts AI right now. Like, it's very obvious, of course, that AI firms selling to other AI firms, et cetera, and this whole Silicon Valley and New York bubble. But who do you think is right to come next in terms of adoption of maybe a little more traditional companies?
Well, I wouldn't think of it in terms of a particular series of waves. I mean, for example, I'm not sure that I would say that the early adopters of artificial intelligence, in sales at least, are firms in Silicon Valley. Unless you mean sort of the obvious, which is I now have, some agentic AI bot. Yeah, I guess that's what they're doing. But I see AI being used in a whole variety of industries in business development already, and industries that I don't think we associate with tech. Construction. AI in construction is already ubiquitous for estimating, project management, etc. Believe it or not, dentistry. I published an article about 3 months ago about how AI over the last few years has really made an impact in dentistry throughout the supply chain. And the reason is because it's become embedded in workflows. So I see AI being used across sectors, not only in tech. I think it gets a lot of publicity in tech because the big AI platform firms, right? You know, Google, Meta, Claude, etc. Those are big tech firms making huge investments that may or may not pay off, by the way, in data centers. You know, think about what they're doing. They're trading a beautiful asset-light business model based on advertising for a very capital-intensive business model. You know, we tend to call that the airline industry, which is not exactly a fount of profits. But, you know, as they say in the gangster movies, they chose this life. They're making that choice.
Right. And so you mentioned construction, for instance, dentistry. Is there anything you can point to where any type of business you could point to where you would say they're more likely to benefit from AI than others, specifically the business development side? And I'll throw 15 seconds of my own thought into that, which is like, there are some industries, obviously, that are extremely relationship based, right? Like where you really have to invest multiple years of drinking coffee and getting on airplanes with people, where like maybe the top of the funnel is not that costly to you. It's more like the middle funnel and the development of deals. Whereas some are just very quick turnover, and they're, you know, the top of funnel might be more expensive. Is that sort of maybe a way of understanding who are adopters, early adopters?
Well, I think in general terms, I'd agree with that. I think that one of the key tasks that salespeople play, especially in business to business markets, is a curating function, right? But if the question is, you know, who will never adopt AI, I would pass on that question. For me, that's like asking in 1985, who will never use the personal computer? It depends on the use case. And I think in the case of AI, here's an analogy that I've heard batted around and I think makes sense to me. Right now, you got to think of AI the way in the 80s, if you were old enough to remember that time, people thought about word processors, right? We had standalone word processors. I'm speaking to you from Boston. One of the big companies in this area was Wang Laboratories, right? They were all about word processors. And then obviously that function, that use case became embedded in larger software. And, you know, who doesn't use that? I think that is also true with AI. We're still discovering the relevant use cases, and they will be embedded in flows. Now, to your point, even in those highly relationship intensive sales situations, which do still predominate in a lot of B2B sectors, that doesn't mean you don't use AI. You're still going to use it for customer research. You're still going to use it to accelerate a number of tasks, and the buyer is going to use it as well. That does not eliminate the salesperson. That gets us back to our first question, the telephone, the national highway system. E-commerce did not eliminate the salesperson, but it did change the nature of the buyer and seller interactions. We're still in the very, very early innings of that.
Right. For someone who is skeptical of the valuations of AI companies, you sound quite excited, though.
Oh, I'm excited about the technology, but I think, you know, and here I'm speaking as a business person. For me, you know, that's a noble calling. We create jobs, we create wealth in society. I don't apologize for that. We're obviously in the early stages of a technological revolution. We were in the stages of a technological revolution when railroads disseminated across the United States in the 19th century. And most of those railroads literally went bankrupt. People forget that. There's a difference between a technology that's going to make a long-term impact on society and the business models. And many of the current business models just don't make sense. I mean, they just don't, but, it's a little bit like we see at the beginning of most technological revolutions. The lab equipment is free, but at a certain point, the market will ask these businesses to pay for their lab equipment. And, as Warren Buffett famously said, when the tide goes out, then you find out who's swimming naked. All right.
Right. Let's talk a bit more about machines doing the selling, or at least supporting it. So in another HBR article, you talk about how SAP adopted AI to sell to SMBs, which was not profitable for them before, but became profitable as they adopted AI. Why did SAP focus on the SME segment for this push?
Well, I mean, the one reason was that the SME segment, and this is true in virtually every developed economy, is a very, very big segment in the aggregate, right? But it's also a very diverse and fragmented market. And especially for a company like SAP, coming from a classic enterprise sales approach, it was simply economically infeasible for them to work with, given their cost of sales. What AI allowed them to do, however, was reduce cost, increase reach, and most importantly, also increase the speed of their response. It reduced their selling cycle significantly. And again, time is money in business. In business, the single biggest determinant of time to cash, cash flow, working capital, and therefore funding requirements. Entrepreneurs get this pretty quickly or else they go out of business. In most businesses, the single biggest determinant of that is the selling cycle. And I can't remember the specific data in the article, Tim, but their selling cycle went from something like 9 months in their big enterprise segment to something like 9 weeks in the SME segment because of what they were able to do with AI and what they were able to do in adapting their sales model in that SME segment to use AI with those buyers. So that's why they were interested. And the impacts there in that particular case study were actually quite significant. And that's not futuristic. That article is about things they were doing 2-3 years ago.
Yeah. And when you say sales model, characterize a little more like what was there before and what changed within their organization and the way they approach sales for SMEs.
Well, I mean, for one thing, it was a completely separate sales organization than the enterprise sales organization. And that meant hiring different types of people at different compensation and incentive structures, precisely because of what the AI was doing. The sales task, when actual human beings, salespeople, got involved in the SME segment, was much more cross-functional. It had much more to do not with convincing somebody to buy this product, but it had much more to do with acting as the boundary person, the interface between that SME customer and what the people in product and customer service needed to do at SAP to tweak it, adapt it for the customer. Most importantly, what the change was, it's a very different buying journey in that small and mid-sized segment than in the big enterprise segment. And clarifying that buying journey was both the prerequisite for SAP to use AI, and that's always my advice, and this would be my advice to your listeners. If you get interested in using AI, start with the buyer and the buying journey. Never even use the phrase AI or tech until you have some pretty damn good understanding of the buying process you're dealing with. Then you ask yourself what technology, and AI may be one among many, that you use to deal with the buying journey. So it was a prerequisite for SAP to use AI. And then once they did, what the AI allowed them to do was adapt things throughout that buying journey and gather good real-time data about how to do that.
Fascinating, yeah. I want to challenge you a little bit on this SAP story. So to me, that seems like a very easy task for AI, especially after going after SMB, bigger market, etc. Now, in much of B2B sales, especially SaaS, we already see this being even easier, right? With the sign up here button, where I don't even need to talk to an employee of, say, Dropbox, below a certain ticket size. Now, with AI, I predict that higher value selling can also be done using technology, and we'll get to this sign up here button without ever talking to a salesperson. Where do you think this will end? Do you agree with me? And do you think that's possible that we say like the checkout button for the $1 billion ticket where, you don't even need to talk to a salesperson anymore?
Well, I mean, again, I agree and disagree. Let me start with the disagreement.
Please.
Where I disagree with, as somebody who ran a business for 11 years and as somebody, I don't have to be humble about who's an easy technology task with redesigning an important business process like a sales model. That is not an easy task. That is a very, very difficult task. It is the hardest thing managers do, and it's what we pay managers to do. So yeah, putting in the sign up button, the agentic thing, that's trivial. But that's not the name of the game. The name of the game is the organizational change, in this case, the sales model. That's not easy. That's very, very difficult. Now, in terms of the using the machine for the higher ticket item sales, yes, but Tim, we already do that. And we have been doing that for years, for decades. E-commerce does that. Usually not with the initial sale, but with rebuys. You can point to dozens and dozens of sales that are rebuys in B2B markets where the ticket price is hundreds of thousands of dollars. But that happens because by that point, the buyer knows exactly what they want. They've worked with the seller on the specs, etc. So I don't think, will that happen? Yes, it will happen, but it's already happening. And AI will be one tool among others that continue to facilitate that. For initial complex sales, however, I think sales reps, people, not AI or the machine, still provide an important curating function and relevant customer education. And the reason is because of what happens at the buyer side in most B2B sales situations. In most companies, when you and I want to buy something, we are in effect competing with each other for some share of a limited budget. Now, that is an economic issue. That is a value proposition issue, but it is also a budgeting and organizational politics issue. The machine can help with some of that, but at the end of the day, trust between the buyer and seller is very, very important. And last time I looked, people establish trust with other people. They don't do it with an algorithm. So yes, is my answer to what you're saying, but I don't think that's new. Well, again, given my original point that you were kind enough to quote, It accelerates a trend that's already there. It doesn't create something new.
Do you think the trust building would be possible though with a machine, say a chatbot as like kind of a new thing rather than where you can have a back and forth rather than sort of an FAQ or something, which is quite limited in its ability to anticipate the other side's concern and like, I don't know if I can get the budget from my CEO, right? Like these typical sales interactions could now be done by agentic work now.
I'm skeptical about that for two reasons. One is, again, Mark Twain, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. What you just said is what I heard again and again and again and again 15, 20 years ago about social media and influencers. Do we trust them now? No, social media went from being this, savior to, oh, it's ruining my teenage kid's life. And secondly, to the extent that nobody still really understands how those large learning model algorithms work, how do we generate trust there? So I'm skeptical. If you're asking, will people follow the advice of a machine? Yes. But I think that's different than the kinds of trust we're talking about when especially in buying in many organizations, you're betting some chunk of your career on the ability of the organization that you just bought from to actually deliver. I'm skeptical that happens with, with an agentic bot.
Right. Maybe it can be expanded, right? If I think about like, why do I not need to talk to a sales rep from Apple ever before I make $1,000 purchase decision for an iPhone is because I trust the brand a lot, right? And so maybe if the brand can be trusted, then there is an ability to go through a sales process. Well, this is a B2C one, but even in B2B one with like more help from agentic elements if the brand overall is already trusted. But if I'm like a no-name brand, then probably there's more of a human interaction that needs to happen. Right?
Well, no, I do think branding is a vital element here, but let's use your Apple example. One is you're saying that after 20 years of the product, and you're saying it about a company, you got to give this company credit, a company that has consistently done a pretty darn good job with their user interface. And even Apple's a good example. I consulted to Apple back when Steve Jobs made the recommendation to look into establishing their own stores. And the rationale behind that was exactly providing this curating function for their products. I recommended against it. Boy, was I wrong. I was dead wrong. So even in that particular example, I think it says something about the limits of the machine and, self-service, as opposed to what goes on in most buyer-seller interactions.
Yeah. I want to hone in on that trust building a little bit. So there's obviously productivity gains from like, say, putting a chatbot into your B2B sales motion, whether that works or not, but there's also always a counter reaction, right? For instance, an erosion of trust, how everyone now assumes that any email they get is written by AI, right? And just like scans for that M dash or something that would be implying that an AI has written that. And therefore, maybe my email that I put a lot of work into might get ignored with it, right? How does this sort of how does this play out over the long term in sales interactions? Like you have productivity gains by using AI for sending out 1,000 emails, for instance, but also you generate like less trust in emails in general. How do you think that will play out over time?
Well, I think we see it playing out. And again, I'll get back, I hate to sort of sound deflationary. I do think AI does represent a technological revolution, but I don't see what you're talking about as fundamentally new. This is what we've been experienced with digital marketing initiatives for the past decade, even before either you or I knew what the initials AI stood for. It's become an increasingly cluttered and expensive space consistently over the last 10 years. And that accelerated during the pandemic, when obviously digital became the preferred mode of interaction for many companies. AI is increasing the clutter there and probably will increase the clutter significantly for the next few years, precisely because in terms of a technology, it's so damn easy to use. So, why not send out another 10,000 emails? You do that, I do that. You can see what's going to happen. It commoditizes that element of marketing. But, and here I want to step back, that's what we should expect. That's what we should expect in any competitive market. And the job of managers, sales managers in particular, is to understand when that's happening, to have data to track it, and then move on to the next area that isn't currently cluttered. That's what competition is about. I don't think AI is new about this, but it will accelerate the noise, and is accelerating the noise that has been accelerating because of other technologies consistently throughout the 21st century. Notice the bottom line here for people in sales and marketing. It's harder to get heard. Yes, it's harder to get heard.
Yeah. And maybe I really like this example you had about marketing, because I can totally see how with like MailChimp and that already exists, how you can send out thousands of messages. People are very concerned about that in sales emails, but actually in marketing, this has happened long ago. So what used to be marketing slop, I'm sure, still is around, right? Like marketing still exists, it didn't go away completely. What changed after that initial shock of like giving people the Prometheus power of like, I guess I can't complete that with fire, but like of firing all kinds of marketing messages out?
Yeah. Well, again, I think what good companies and smart managers do is try to find, I think of it in financial terms. What you're taught to do in almost any finance course you take is allocate your financial resources for the highest net present value investments. And especially in marketing and sales, those returns, that net present value, to use the financial jargon, that's a dynamic number. It's not just one number. You move on to the next, but at the same time, you make sure you take care of productivity. Productivity gains matter. And in my experience, they matter a lot more than most people realize. And the reason is because of the nature of competition in any free market. Now, the way I phrase this, Tim, may take certain people aback, but it's a basic fact about competition, marketing, selling. In business, you do not compete with the dead. And what I mean by that is you do not compete with companies that have gone out of business. You only compete with companies that are still in business. What does it take to stay in business in any dynamic, changing market? You must adapt best practices. You must, or else you will be among the dead. You will go out of business. Notice the implication there. And by the way, this is good for society, but it makes managers' jobs difficult. The bar is always rising. What we expected in terms of productivity 20 years ago is sort of standard operating procedure today, precisely because of continual best practice adoption. There is no alternative to understanding and generating a continuous improvement dynamic in businesses. And that's the way to think about AI. Where does it help me with this? And where is it just another cost of doing business, right? The way much digital marketing currently is for companies.
Yeah, yeah. I want to switch gears a little bit. In your fabulous book here, Sales Management That Works, you talk a lot about talent and hiring. Now, this is like one of the big implications of productivity that always is like the knee-jerk reaction almost of like, are a bunch of people going to lose their jobs? Before we talk about that, because I think that's especially a problem for MBA students right now, how is the skill profile of the sales workforce changing right now with AI?
Well, I mean, again, let me take advantage of my balding career and experience and urge our listeners first to step back and realize that there have always been challenges in sales hiring that do not exist to the same extent in most other business functions. For example, if you want to hire someone in finance or accounting, you can go to a school and you can find people that majored in that subject matter, right? Same is true, by the way, in computer programming. Same is true increasingly in AI, data science, etc. But the last time I looked, which was about 4 years ago when I started writing that book that you kindly held up, of the more than 4,000 colleges and universities in the United States, less than 300 even offered a sales course, let alone a sales program. So this is an area of business where the vast majority of people start out knowing almost nothing about what they're going to get paid for. It is classic learning by doing. All right. So that's number one. Now, how does AI affect that? I think it does affect the number of people that companies will hire. The MBA market for the last few years is a good example of that. You know, the big buyers of MBA students historically are the banks, the consulting firms, private equity. And, you know, 2 years ago, they would come to a place like Harvard and other places and say, you know, last year I hired 10 people from your school. This year, because of AI, I only need 8. The next year, 6, right? I think that is going on in sales. But who you hire, those remaining 5 or 6, I'm not sure AI is making a huge difference there for 2 reasons. One is, I think any smart sales manager knows they're hiring somebody for sales, for business development, right? They're not hiring them to be an AI guru. They're hiring them to use AI in that larger set of job responsibilities. And secondly, AI is a good example of already a good example of what we see consistently with these technologies. They become more and more user friendly. You know, so, you know, hiring someone in sales for AI is a little bit like saying 40 years ago, I run a telemarketing operation. I better hire people who know how to use the phone. You know, doing the prompts is not that difficult. We can train for that in an afternoon. Doing sales, selling, and relationships, that's different. That's what I need to spend my time looking for when I hire.
Tell me then if this, it sounds like this doesn't make sense to you, which is why I'm excited to introduce it. There's a company called Clay, which does some of the AI tools for sales. I work with that software a lot, and they introduced this new idea of early junior hiring in sales now should look like what they call a go-to-market engineer. And what they mean by that is a role that is half sales and half software engineer. Specifically, they argue that the AI side is actually not that easy to engineer because you need not just prompt engineering, you need A/B testing, etc. Much more data-driven in their telling of this role, where you set up experiments, etc., and you know a bit about, you know, data management, etc. But then the other part of it is getting on the phone and talking to people. It sounds like you wouldn't agree with that being the future of junior sales roles. You would say, no, it should still be on the sales side.
Yep, basically, I agree with that way of thinking about the division of labor. There's the selling, there's what AI can help me do as part of my data analytics. But I think what I'm seeing and what I think we will see as this scales is what we saw in SaaS and many other firms. Yet we have our salespeople, and then we usually had a separate group doing those data analytics. And I think that's true with AI. And one thing I learned running a business and working with businesses, especially when it comes to people, don't try to put the square peg in the round hole. It rarely works. Now, when you can find somebody who can do selling superbly and is also what this firm is calling a great data engineer, hire them. That's my advice. When you can find a Renaissance man or woman like Michelangelo or Leonardo da Vinci, hire them. But there aren't that many Michelangelos and da Vincis out there. So the issue is not, can the superhero do a great job? The issue is, what do I do with people like you and me, reasonably intelligent people, but not superheroes. And there, I think the division of labor is more effective than trying to get somebody to leap tall buildings at a single bound.
Yeah, fair enough. I'm sure you see a lot of students at Harvard who are concerned about their entry-level career path. Now, if someone wants to go into sales, what is your advice to them?
Well, I mean, my advice and, the good news, I guess, I'm old enough. When I was a junior professor, I was sort of one of the very, very, very few people on the Harvard Business School faculty who did anything involved with sales. Business schools, this is back in the 90s, they all had what I would call an intellectual inferiority complex, physics envy. Sales sounded much too tactical. The good news is, because of the interest in entrepreneur this, entrepreneur that, that's no longer the case. You don't have to convince a student interested in an entrepreneurial activity, they better know something about business development and sales. So there's a huge amount of interest. And I get exactly the question you're raising daily. Here's my standard advice, and I have a bias about this. My bias is that if you're smart enough and have gone through the time and cost of getting that kind of degree, when you think about your career, you should not aspire to be the best salesperson or best sales leader in the world, although that's a noble calling. It's a very, sales is fundamental to business. It's a core activity, all right? But you should aspire to run something, maybe as an entrepreneur, maybe as a line of business head, etc. And their companies are very, very different. You know that old phrase, culture eats strategy for breakfast? It's not true. Culture eats strategy for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And this varies by companies. In some companies, spending time in sales is a de facto requirement for getting profit and loss responsibility, a line of business job. In other companies, some tech companies, it's all about product and sales. And I have seen this. Sales is literally invited out of the room when we start to talk about strategy or pricing, because we don't want the children to know our cost structure. They may give it away in discounts. That, I think, is the way you have to think about a career in sales. And notice that has almost nothing to do with AI. It has to do, as usual in business, with people, the business model, the culture.
And so, to summarize that point, your advice is to aspire to run something like to get the sales experience by running something small and then building up from there.
Yeah, and then if along the way you find, like many people in sales, why do people stay in sales? basically they value the autonomy, right? I make my numbers, they leave me alone. If that turns out to be who you are, great. On the other hand, if you do want to aspire to be a line of business head with all the agita that brings, then ask yourself whether in this company sales is a good route to that, or whether it's what I call the velvet ghetto. You'll make good money, they won't bother you after 5 p.m., but you're really not part of the leadership team. They're different types of companies.
Got it. All right. Well, closing question. When you step back from the current AI cycle a bit, what do you think people will look back at and say, like, we really didn't get this right in 2026?
Yeah. Well, again, I'm old enough, frankly, to have seen this movie a few times. And again, in the early stages of any significant technology development, I typically see two things. One is what I've already been talking about, Tim, and that is fundamentally confusion of the technology, in this case, artificial intelligence, with business, right? AI is clearly a very, very powerful tool if you have a relevant sales model. But AI is not the same as a sales model, and many people think it is right now. They're going to pay for this. I guarantee it. Again, you start with the buyer. What does that mean for my selling? Then you worry about technology. The other thing that I would say in particular with AI is only as good as the data inputs. What the IT people call GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. Nobody has repealed that law with AI. And this is, I think, the big task facing companies, which is why earlier I said, putting in the bot is trivial, but not changing the organization. You've got to clean up your data to really get use from this technology. And that is a much, much more expensive and bigger task, and especially with large language models. Microsoft did a very good bit of research about this. In traditional IT systems, when you want to delete a data set, it's easy. With large language models, it is much more expensive and difficult. So keeping that data up to date, avoiding garbage in, garbage out, is a bigger issue in AI. And I think it's only now taking people by surprise when they say, wow, how much use will I make out of this? Those would be the two things that I would point to. And again, I don't think they're new. I've seen that movie before.
Right. So technology is not a replacement for a sales model. We'll need to painfully learn again. And garbage in, garbage out on the data quality that all these AI models are.
Yeah, garbage in, garbage out, I think is older than I am as a phrase about technology, and it's fundamentally true.
Great. Well, Frank, this has been such a joy. Thank you so much for taking 45 minutes to chat with me about this. I love it. Thank you.
Tim, thank you. My pleasure. My very best wishes to you and to our listeners.